You're about to meet the innovators and influencers who are restoring the Judeo-Christian foundations of our culture right here on The Patrick Coffin Show.
And now, here's your host, Patrick Coffin.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to the show. This is your first time hanging out here. Welcome. We talk about the lasting things of life, and we go upstream from politics to culture, and we talk about best practices for repairing the DNA damage done to the country along the way and to the West generally. Today we're going to talk about something, in some ways, it's the biggest untold story of the last 100 years, how that century was shaped. Most of my listeners and viewers grew up either under or in the presidency of Ronald Reagan and the papacy of now St. John Paul II the Great. But very few people know about the deep friendship between this pope and this president and how their two lives work, their projects of life, their vocations uniquely overlapped. And it was a powerful collaboration that brought down communism, particularly in Russia. There's a new book about all this titled A Pope and a President, John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and the Untold Story of the 20th Century. Its author is my good friend, Dr. Paul Kengor. He's the New York Times bestselling author of God and Reagan, Dupes, The Communist, and other books. He's a professor of political science and the executive director of the Center for Vision and Values at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. From his kidney-shaped pool somewhere near Fiji, Paul Kengor, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Patrick. How are you?
I'm doing great. I always love talking to you, Paul, and I'm honored that you're on my new joint here. So thanks for being with
me. Same to you. It's good to finally be on your show. Thank you.
Thanks. As you know, I'm a big Sheenist, a devotee and spiritual son of Venerable Fulton J. Sheen, and Sheen is a very, I think Sheen is in some ways the glue between President Ronald Reagan and John Paul II. And by this I mean, even if, and I'll ask you about their overlaps of life and whether or not Reagan ever met Bishop Sheen, but here's this very quintessentially iconic American Catholic prelate who is deeply in love with America, very knowledgeable of the founding documents, but also an expert in Soviet communism and the Constitution there and the history of Russia. And so here's this great American communicator of the gospel as a kind of spiritual liaison between the Protestant American Ronald Reagan and the Polish Catholic pontiff. If you've read the last book by Bishop Sheen, it's called Treasure in Clay, he says some things there about John Paul II that he really couldn't have known. He'd only been Pope for a year, but obviously Sheen was a student of the thought of John Paul II. Maybe we can just start with the Bishop Sheen connection, because you eloquently describe Sheen's efforts on television and in the pulpit here in the U.S. During the Cold War era to tell people what communism is and what the actual threat was.
Well, that's right, Patrick. And I pretty much start, Sheen is a running thread throughout the book. I mention him. The opening of the book is on May 13th, 1981, with the shooting of John Paul II. And then I drop back to May 13th, 1917, with Mary's first appearance at Fatima. And that first chapter, May 13th, 1917, I end with Sheen, because Sheen talked about Fatima as being the only city in all of Portugal named for the favorite daughter of Muhammad. And he wondered if there was some connection here to the Muslim world as well. Father Andrew Apostoli has written about this as well recently. And Apostoli, of course, knows Sheen very, very well. But Sheen was just brilliant. I mean, he really was. I can't think of any American Catholic ever who I think was as insightful, as prophetic, as prescient as he was on the communist threat. And you'll find this interesting. I mean, I'm a convert. I mean, I'm technically a revert, but I always tell people I'm a convert because, I mean, I grew up in the dark ages, the 1970s. All right, so I knew nothing at all about the Catholic Church, being raised in it. I became an agnostic, if not an atheist. Yeah. And I really became a Christian through evangelicals and becoming a Protestant. I know Catholics will say, well, you were baptized, you were whatever. But I mean, I'm as close to a convert as you can get. But I remember the first time that I heard Fulton Sheen's name was my friend Jim Miller from out in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was talking to me about Fulton Sheen, and I didn't even know who he was. And he said, "How old are you?" And I told him, I said, "Well, I was born in 1966." And he said, All right, because Sheen died, what, 79, 80?
79, yeah, December 10th, 79.
Yeah, and then once I saw some EWTN videos and so forth, I recognized him, and then I knew who he was. But when I heard him again was through Bill Clark, and Clark was Reagan's closest advisor. I became Clark's biographer. He was like a grandfather to me.
The Judge, right? Just
The Judge. The Judge.
Mm-hmm.
It was published by Ignatius Press, 2007. And when I asked Clark, I said, Clark became Reagan's closest advisor, but he decided to go to seminary first, or at least he considered going to seminary. He went to an Augustinian novitiate in New York, and this would have been 1948-49, Patrick. Mm-hmm. And I said, were there any particular books that influenced you? And he didn't hesitate. He said, yes. Thomas Merton's The Seven-Story Mountain.
Yep.
And he said Fulton Sheen's Piece of Soul. Mm. And when he said that, I'm not making this up, Clark had a reprinted edition of Piece of Soul on his ranch living room desk. And that came out, I think, in 1948, 49, roughly. Communism and the Conscience of the West came out just a year after that or before that. The exact dates are like 48, 49, the two books. That is an amazing book. I mean, he went back. I mean, I'm a scholar of communism, the Cold War, Marxism. Sheen had quotes in there from Marx that I've still not seen from anybody else. And Sheen was getting them from original French editions, and Sheen was translating them out of French and into English, including the Marx quote, "Communism begins where atheism begins," which really, I think, typifies communism and communist thinking. But Sheen was onto this. He understood all of this. He understood the threats in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And this is a long answer to your question. I hope I'm not rambling too much here.
No, it's fascinating.
He and Ronald Reagan were from the same neighborhood. I mean, if not quite literally neighborhood, Peoria, Illinois, which is just down the street from Eureka College. I mean, you get on Eureka College, which was Reagan's college, and you drive, I think it's north. I mean, it's as straight of a road as you can get through flat Illinois, and you see Peoria way ahead. You get to Peoria. There's 2 or 3 different churches there where Sheen was a pastor or an altar boy or whatever. And then you keep going. You eventually get up to Galesburg, Illinois, Dixon, Illinois, Tampico, Illinois, where Ronald Reagan's dad. I mean, I can't say this for sure, but I can't imagine that Ronald Reagan, with his brother Neil, who to the end of his life was a daily communicant, and his Catholic dad, who we think was maybe apathetic Catholic, it's hard to figure out. I can't imagine Reagan at some point in the 1920s not going into a church with his dad and his brother, a Catholic church, somewhere in Peoria, wherever, where there's a young priest by the name of Fulton Sheen in there.
Who's already getting a name. And I've interviewed Michael Reagan, President Reagan's son, a couple of times, and I believe Jane Wyman, his stepmom, became a Catholic later in life. And I'm bringing Jane Wyman up because Bishop Sheen had a lot of close friends in the upper echelons of Hollywood. He never talked about it, but he would speak at prayer breakfasts and so on. He had his finger on the pulse of what was happening in the entertainment industry. And this goes to the similarity between, I know we're talking about John Paul II, but his protege, in some ways, Fulton Sheen, loved communists. And I think Ronald Reagan loved communists. He prayed for Hinckley, as John Paul II prayed for his assailant. So there was a great separation in the minds of both John Paul II and Ronald Reagan between the ideology, which is satanic. Reagan, I don't think, used the word satanic. John Paul II certainly would have. And the people who are duped by it, to circle back to one of your books. Do you think that's a fair distinction to make? Because it seems like both were deeply wedded to the idea that the human person has dignity and value and worth, irrespective of the colossal mistakes that people fall prey to or misbegotten ideologies.
Well, that's right. Reagan used words like evil, pernicious, disease to describe communism, a form of madness, form of lunacy. So, I mean, he used the strongest language you possibly could. But, I mean, the church in the time of Fulton Sheen, I'm thinking 1937 Divini Redemptoris, the encyclical on atheistic communism, referred to communism as a satanic scourge, a satanic scourge. So the church had been using language like that all the way back to Pope Pius IX, 1846, Qui Pluribus. That's 2 years before the Communist Manifesto was published.
Yeah.
And it was using that kind of language about communism. And people forget, 1848 Communist Manifesto didn't invent communism, but that was the statement. It was the program, the manifesto for the Communist Party that then existed. If you will, they had Marx and Engels write it, so it had been around. But backing up to what you first said, so yeah, Jane Wyman, who was Ronald Reagan's first wife, and Ronald Reagan did not want that divorce. Okay, he did not want that. He was crushed by that. He was devastated by that. I mean, he really saw marriage as a lifelong commitment. He did not want it. Jane wanted it. And Jane had a very difficult period, but by the end of her life was a third-order Dominican nun.
Buried in the habit, I think, Michael
Buried
said.
in the habit.
Yeah.
I think I don't know this for sure, but I mean, she very well might have led the last 20 or 30 years of her life a celibate I mean, chastity, chaste. So, but before she met Reagan, she was married and divorced once or twice. And she married Reagan at a very young age, and then after that was divorced and married, I think, twice more.
Yeah, you hate to say it, but that is common. It
is. It is. But she came into the church along with Michael and Maureen. So Michael was adopted, and Maureen was their biological child, Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman. They had a daughter named Christine who died shortly after birth. And so Jane came into the church with Maureen and Michael on the feast day of the Immaculate Conception, December 8, 1954. And she was a convert of Loretta Young and Fulton Sheen. And Michael told me, Patrick, that he remembered going to the annual Fulton Sheen breakfast in Hollywood, and all the big Catholics in Hollywood and some non-Catholics were there as well. And the joke was always that Fulton Sheen was the biggest celebrity in the building. But he was he was very connected to all of them. Michael met him, and the one thing that I've not been able to nail down, and I've been asked this by people from northwestern Illinois, Sheen Reagan country, did Reagan and Sheen ever meet? And I asked Nancy Reagan, and in fact, I asked her, I think, 3 or 4 times. As I was going through my final notes when I was putting all the book together, I found several emails that I had printed. I try to keep a hard copy, right, of special emails like this. I think I asked her 3 or 4 times if they ever met. And she said, it's hard to imagine that they didn't. She said, but I can't say for sure if they did. But they had like 2 of the top shows on television throughout the mid to late 1950s at the exact same time. They were both Hollywood stars. So surely they had to have met at some point.
I'll have to ask Michael, or maybe you can. Michael might know. I
asked Michael. I think
he didn't know either.
He didn't know. Yeah. And sometimes it sounds weird to people, right? But as a historian, you run through this. Sometimes people forget something that they knew, and it could come back to them later as well. I've seen that with a lot of different people and historical figures. It happens a lot. Yeah. And people will poke holes through that in historical research. But no, you got to understand, in historical research, this happens. I've got a major document in this book where President George H.W. Bush, this was the document on the Soviets being involved in the shooting of John Paul II, the CIA report. Yes. When George H.W. Bush read it, he dated it, I think it's 2/23/85. Don't quote me on that. It's in the book. And the actual date had to have been April 23rd, 85. Yeah. So you're like, wait, how did this happen? It didn't come out till April. Why is it February? Well, somebody crossed it out and wrote a new date on it. He just wrote down the wrong
wrong date.
This kind of thing happens all the time.
In a way, that goes to its veracity, doesn't it? We all know what carelessness about dates mean. You get the month and the day mixed up. Who cares?
Sure. I've signed books all night at a book signing and signed them June 18th when it was June 19th. You know, that happens.
Gotcha. I watched an old 1954 Life is Worth Living as part of my interview prep with our chat today, Paul, and I came across something I'd heard before on MP3 form, but I hadn't seen him deliver it, and that's the 1954 message on Life is Worth Living by Bishop Sheen on Our Lady of Fatima. And he spins a story. I thought, this sounds really familiar. I read that story in A Pope and a President.
All right.
And it's a man who was known to be an unusual mix of intellectual prowess and personal holiness and diplomatic savvy, and that's Eugenio Pacelli, who was almost ambushed by By whom? Tell the story about the gun and being thrown at the cross, because this loops back to Fulton Sheen was wearing that cross in that broadcast that he got from his boss, Cardinal Spellman, who was a close friend of Eugenio Pacelli. That's a fascinating tale.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, is also a thread throughout this book. And if there was one pope that the communists succeeded in assassinating, it was Pius XII, and by that I mean character assassination, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they permanently labeled him Hitler's pope. And I mean, that was successful character assassination. If Stalin could have gotten his hands around the neck of Pius XII, he would have personally strangled him. They would have put a noose around him and hung him from the Sistine Chapel if they could have. Mm-hmm. They couldn't, so instead they labeled him Hitler's Pope. You know, that started in a Radio Moscow broadcast. Our friends Ron Richlack and Ion Mihai Pachepa in their book Disinformation, and some other Richlack books, they go through this. So, you know, Catholics are now doing a great job of showing just how maligned Pius XII was. Yeah. But this goes back to, I mean, he was ordained in May 13th, 1917.
Yeah, the exact date of I believe, the second apparition of Our Lady to the children in Fatima. Same day. Well,
yeah, May 13th. So it would have been the first. It would have been May 13th, 1917, the first apparition, the feast day, what became the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima.
I know. I was thinking of the Angel of Fatima. That became before.
That
okay, yes.
Sorry. That's right. So Pacelli, of all things, was ordained that day, or consecrated that day, and he became Bishop of Bavaria. Where, I mean, people forget this. The communists, before or even during, when they were taking Soviet Russia, or Russia at the time, they were trying to take Bavaria. They wanted a Bavarian Soviet Republic. They were trying to take places like Hungary. They tried to take Poland. In fact, it was Karol Wojtyła's father, who was, you know, part of the military in that day that resisted Lenin and the Poles in Poland, when communism could have come to Eastern Europe 20, 25 years earlier than it did. But Pacelli was attacked a number of times. They tried to assassinate him. Communists tried to assassinate him. And in one case, this was not when they riddled his house with bullets. He wasn't there, fortunately, that day. But in another case, they walked in. I tell the story in the book. And one of the communists took a gun and threw it at him. Now, as to why he threw the gun rather than shooting it, no one's exactly sure. Maybe it was out of bullets. Maybe this was simply out of frustration or whatever he did, but he threw his gun at Pacelli really hard. I mean, you know, guns are heavy and they're metal objects. They can hurt you. And it hit him. It hit him right in this pectoral cross, and it bounced off of him. Well, Sheen, in that Life is Worth Living broadcast, tells this story of this young priest, young bishop at the time, and he says, and now that young priest bishop is Pope Pius XII, our Pope, and that pectoral cross I am wearing here today. Right. And he shows it on national television. Of course, the place just goes absolutely nuts. And it's classic dramatic, theatrical Sheen, but the beautiful thing about it is it's a true story. And Sheen met many times with Pius XII, and Pius XII gave that pectoral cross to him, and Sheen wore it on the set.
I wonder if President Reagan, I believe he would have been governor of California when Karol Wojtyła came to the United States. He was on a speaking tour.
Correct.
I want to say 67. I know he was here in 1976 in Philadelphia.
Yes.
A lot was going on then, but it's I would be very fascinated to know if those two ever met in the flesh. Odd that there's nothing published about it.
Right, and that would have been, so I'm trying to think, it was latter 1960s. I know this because one of my favorite Polish churches in Pittsburgh, there's a kneeler there from where Cardinal Wojtyła went in and just dropped in one day in the middle of the day. And there were a couple of old Polish Pittsburgh women outside taking care of things, and they started talking to them in Polish, and they asked if he could go in and pray. They said, sure, go in and pray. And I don't think Reagan had any encounter with them at that point. But in 1976, this was the summer of 76, right? The bicentennial, 1976. And Karol Wojtyła came to the United States for a Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia, gave a beautiful speech on freedom, human nature, the interdependence of faith and freedom.
And the anti-church, right? There's something mystical, apocalyptic in his message, as I recall.
That's right. It's beautiful stuff. It's really some of it's chilling, captivating. And at that point in time, the biggest Catholics in the United States were people like Fulton Sheen, Dorothy Day, I think Cardinal Kroll, Cardinal Cook, and Mother Teresa was there. So Wojtyła and Mother Teresa weren't really known at that point, but he gave a stirring speech, and I don't think Reagan met him. I don't think Reagan was anywhere near him at that time, Patrick, but I think this is interesting. I bet, and I think you could be very confident of this, if Karol Wojtyła was in a hotel room at any point during that trip, which he was, because he went all over, traveled a lot, and if he had a TV in that hotel room, which he did, if he would have turned that thing on, there are probably 3 channels, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and especially in the evening, depending on exactly when he would have been here. But he would have been here watching the evening news, seeing this candidate named Ronald Reagan challenging Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination for the United States. And one of the reasons why Reagan challenged Gerald Ford at that time was because of Ford's accommodation of the Soviets. His détente, his refusing to meet with Alexander Solzhenitsyn the summer before, because Ford was afraid that would offend the Soviets and it would hurt détente.
Okay.
Ford referred to Alexander Solzhenitsyn as a, I'm quoting him here, so this isn't my language, but as a G-damned horse's ass. That's what Ford referred to Solzhenitsyn. National Review almost considered endorsing Jimmy Carter. They were so angry at Ford over stubbing Solzhenitsyn. And for Reagan, this was the last straw. So John Paul II would have really appreciated this anti-communist Reagan challenging Ford, who wasn't pro-communist, but he was accommodating the communists. And by the way, Ford's détente was very similar to the Ostpolitik of
I was going to ask you
Paul
about that. Yeah, and that détente, Ostpolitik. For people who've never heard the phrase Ostpolitik, what's the shorthand English equivalent?
It's basically a Western European version of détente or accommodation of the Soviets. It's the idea, Ostpolitik and détente basically argued, look, Soviets, they're going to be around for a long time, okay? Eastern Europe is part of this, is a Soviet satellite area. The captive nations are part of the Soviet bloc. The Soviets have hegemony there. That's their sphere of influence, okay? Ours in the West is Western Europe, so let them have what they have.
Okay, kind of laissez-faire, live and let live.
And Reagan said, that's immoral. Because the people in Eastern Europe, Poland, Bulgaria, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, they don't want to be part of the Soviet communist bloc. They have no religious freedom. They don't have the right to emigrate. They don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of press. You're selling your brethren down the river with this. Yeah. So Reagan thought that was immoral, and he challenged Gerald Ford. Well, and to go back to your point, so Karol Wojtyła probably would have at least heard about, if not seen Reagan on TV at that time, including leading right up to the really dramatic moment where Reagan at the Kemper Arena in Kansas City in August 1976 challenged Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination and just missed.
There's so many ways to bounce the ball just based on what you just said, Paul. You're ruining my interview here. It's so much golden content. I want to talk a little bit about Reagan's own political conversion. My friend Douglas Urbanski is the manager of actor Gary Oldman, now owns what was once Olivia de Havilland's home in Bel Air.
Right.
And Olivia tells...
I know him. It's interesting. It's a great story. Go ahead.
Well, Olivia told him, Douglas, that Ronald Reagan made the decision in what was then her living room at a group of conservative-minded actors to make his life work, the opposition of communism, to communism. And I think Reagan tried to stay in the Democratic Party as long as he could. Maybe it was a job thing. Hollywood was certainly, as it is today, more skewing soft left. I mean, yesterday's categories don't really fit with today's, but
right.
Ronald Reagan eventually decided that the party had gone communist on him, at least in terms of the spine left the building. And that's very much in line where Reagan ended up politically, seems to be lockstep with where Cardinal Pacelli and then later Pius XII was, because you note in the book conversations that then Pacelli had with President FDR, and I detect there's a kind of a duped thing going on there, or
totally.
naivete about people's intentions on the other side.
Yeah, this was when Pacelli visited the United States as Secretary of State Camerlengo to the Vatican. This would have been 1936. And that information that I found, I got mostly from the Kennedy Library. Fascinating. I had never seen any of this before.
He went everywhere. He went everywhere.
He went everywhere. Yeah. He really did. He was basically the first pope in the United States, prior to being pope. And in fact, Mrs. Kennedy, Rose Kennedy, her notes on this said, our meeting in Bronxville with Pope Pius XII, then Eugenio Pacelli, or something like that, she wrote in hand across the top of the document. So you could tell she went back and updated it later. But Pacelli had a really nice meeting with FDR. They talked different languages because Pacelli was, spoke 6, 7 different languages at least. I think they spoke French.
Yeah, I think they had French in common, I think.
Yeah, French and English. And at one point, as they got into sort of a verbal sparring match about communism, and Pacelli said to FDR, Mr. President, you don't know anything about the communist threat. You do not understand the communist threat. And FDR, typical FDR, I don't know if he called him Gene, right? But Gene, I'm telling you, buddy, it's those fascists you got to watch out for. Communists, I got them. I got the communists taken. I got the communists. But in fact, the communists were infiltrating his administration, not by the thousands. Yeah. Okay, but by dozens, and possibly, and throughout the larger administration, many more than that. But Pacelli realized that FDR didn't understand the communist threat, and for Reagan realized Reagan was an FDR liberal. He called himself a hemophiliac liberal, a bleeding heart liberal. And Reagan realized that people in the Democratic Party, including himself, were not realizing the communists weren't under the bed, they were in the bed. And the communists had figured out that Democrats being soft on the communist threat, not being pro-communist, but just not chastened enough, not just attuned enough, that the Democrats and liberals were being used as dupes by communists. And one of those FDR Democrats who was used and duped was Reagan. Reagan became an after-dinner speaker to progressive groups that he soon learned were communist front groups. Reagan was a dupe. Reagan was duped. So that night, the home that Doug Urbanski owns now, that was owned by Olivia de Havilland. By the way, Patrick, she's still alive.
Boy, would I love to talk with her, honestly. She's just the picture of that golden age of elegance and professionalism and entertainment. And boy, yeah.
She's over 100 years old.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think she just turned 100. And for people who don't know, Olivia de Havilland was the saintly Melanie in Gone with the Wind.
That's right, Melanie. That's right.
And she, the opposite of Scarlett O'Hara. And she also made movies with Reagan like Santa Fe Trail with who's the great famous swashbuckling Errol Flynn.
Errol Flynn, yeah.
She also did the movie The Heiress. Beautiful, wonderful, wonderful actress. But Reagan that night realized, Reagan for the first time in one of these speeches decided to bring in communism at the end. And so he would denounce fascism in all these speeches in the 1946-47 where he's bashing the Nazis. And his pastor had told him at his church, he said, Ron, it's a great speech, but Hitler's dead. You find hardly any pro-Nazis anywhere. Really, Ron, the big threat that's out there, listen to Churchill, listen to some of these others. It's communism. It's the Soviet Union. I think your speech would be much more effective if you added in something at the end about the communist threat. And Reagan thought, that's a good idea. So Reagan added a line at the end of the speech. He said, there's another threat out there today. It's the communist threat. And if this ever becomes as much a threat in the United States as Nazism was, I will condemn that just as strongly. And suddenly the speech that always ended with John Howard Lawson, Dalton Trumbo, and all these Hollywood 10 communist types, wildly applauding, Reagan said you could hear a pin drop, just daggers staring at him. Yeah. And Reagan said, I realized at that point that something was up. And it was that night that he went back to Olivia de Havilland's house. He had been invited by one of the other liberal actors who wasn't pro-communist. So why don't you come back to Olivia de Havilland's house? We're going to meet on this. And he got there, and he and Olivia said to each other, they said, I thought you were one of them. I thought you were one of them. And no, they were anti-communist liberals. But for Reagan, that began an awakening where he realized that the larger Democratic Party, with the exception of people like JFK, right?
Just going to mention JFK was another one who was wise to it.
Yeah, but by the late 60s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, the party, especially after Watergate, went far left. And Reagan realized at that point, I hadn't left the Democratic Party left me, as he put it.
And both John Paul II and Ronald Reagan shot in the same year, separated by several months. Has there ever been any research beyond the fact that Hinckley was a loon, he was mentally ill? Is there any credible conspiracy hypothesis that someone hired him, or he just wanted to impress Jodie Foster?
He just wanted to impress Jodie Foster. Yeah, we've never seen anything beyond that. This was just an isolated kind of lone gunman who was, as Reagan put it, a confused young man, as Reagan put it, a messed up young man who I believe that he was looking for any way to get Jodie Foster's attention. And I think he had read in the Washington Star, which is no longer published, but it was a very popular daily newspaper in Washington at the time. He was in Washington, and he looked in the newspaper that day, and it had Reagan's presidential schedule, where he was going to be. I think Lee Harvey Oswald had a schedule of JFK's from the local newspaper as well. He's going to be right here at this exact time, and right there at that exact time. Newspapers don't usually do this. I don't think they do this anymore. Yeah. But Hinckley was in a hotel across the street, and he said, "Whoa, Shazam! Look at that." And he's going to be right there.
Shockingly, it didn't really affect Miss Foster's ardor for him. Didn't quite work, did it?
No, it did. It did not. She didn't suddenly give herself to him.
Mehmet Ali Agha was not trying to impress a woman, maybe trying to impress his communist boss. Now, there's another example of a Muslim Turk who seems to be duped. Paul, these guys have the same classic textbook background: angry, resentment, bad father, alcoholic, abusive dad, ready for something to be fomented, falls in the wrong crowd. Didn't the relatives of Agha say, look, there was a turning point where he got radicalized?
Yeah, and it was when he went to college, when he went to the university.
Shock.
Yeah,
Right.
It happens to everybody. It really does. I mean, even in the Middle East. And his mother said, no, he was a very good boy. And his teachers said that he was one of the smartest kids in the class. They said he read absolutely everything. He had a bad father. He had an abusive, alcoholic father. Some people think that he wasn't even a very devout Muslim. I mean, they just weren't exactly sure what he believed. He was Muslim. But as far as his level of devoutness, that wasn't very clear. But he did fall in with radical elements at the university. And the Soviets were all through the Middle East. I mean, they were looking for client states. They were looking for terrorists that they could hire. They were running terrorist training centers. And so they eventually found this guy, Mehmet Ali Agha. And by the way, and this is something I talk about in the book, before he took his shot at the Holy Father, May 13th, 1981, he tried to kill Lech Walesa. And he tried to kill Lech Walesa in Rome. And by the way, Patrick, if he had succeeded, this would have been by a bomb. This would have been, Ronald Reagan would have awakened on the morning of his inauguration, January 20th, 1981, a day of such promise, where Reagan's already thinking to himself, I can't wait to meet with the Polish president, to reach out, to try to use Poland and the solidarity movement to take out the Soviet bloc. Agha, that very day, his plan was to blow up, literally, Lech Walesa. And Walesa had just met with John Paul II. They had Mass together in the private chapel. John Paul II gave him his blessing, and he went back to his hotel, and amazingly, the whole thing failed. But he would try again May 13th, 1981, and this time with John Paul II, he would nearly succeed.
I understand that he paused to wait for the Holy Father to finish kissing a baby that was handed to him.
That's right. That's right. And he had just passed the obelisk in St. Peter's Square, where we consider the first Pope, Peter, had been martyred almost 2,000 years earlier. Had gone past that obelisk, went around, and really it was 9 o'clock, around 9 a.m. that morning that Agha was dropped off near St. Peter's Square. So they waited all day, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. And at a time that George Weigel in Witness to Hope says was 5:13 p.m. So would have matched
May 13th on the time clock.
That's right. Would have matched the date in the calendar, 5/13/81. John Paul II finally came up, and Asha, I think about 20 feet away, at 9mm Browning semi-automatic, held up, took 4 shots, and hit him twice. And he went down into the arms of Father Zivich.
Yes, his longtime friend and secretary, and then the Cardinal of Warsaw. There's so much here, Paul. After the shots rang out, Aja is captured. You say his communist overlords intended to have him killed the same day.
That's right, and he was grabbed by a nun named Sister Letitia.
This is something a Hollywood screenwriter would never dare put in a movie because no one would believe it.
No one except for kids raised by nuns in Catholic schools.
Yeah, with the knuckle wounds to prove it. Yeah.
Yeah. But Sister Letitia grabbed him and held him down, and she said, "Why did you do it?" And he said, "I didn't do it. I didn't do it." She said, "Yes, you did. You did it." And he said, "I didn't do it." But she and a couple of bystanders held him down. Asha didn't realize it, but this little sturdy nun was saving his life.
Yeah.
Because his communist friends had planned, when he got back into the truck that was a concealed household goods company, a Bulgarian truck, they were going to put him in the back of it and they were going to shoot him. There's no way they're going to give him a check for $300 grand, pat him on the back, and send him off to Aruba. There was no way they were going to let him walk away.
Gotcha.
A friend of mine said to me, just like the mafia, they were going to, and I said, no, don't insult the mafia by comparing it to the communists. All right, the mafia had more honor than these guys. I mean, these guys were thugs extraordinaire, but they were going to let him live. The only reason that he survived was because this nun held him down, and so they took him off to an Italian prison.
Very interesting. I was thinking about the scene that is now famously recorded, that before he went under the knife, Reagan took in the doctors and said, "I hope you're all hope you're all Republicans." I was wondering if John Paul II would have said any Protestants here, but probably not.
No,
probably
but you know
not.
what he did say?
Yeah.
And this is fascinating. So those are among Reagan's last words. Reagan's last thoughts, which he wrote in his diary, he had this powerful sense from his mother, his Christian faith, disciples of Christ, Protestant faith, for forgiveness. He said, he felt that if he didn't forgive his shooter, he wasn't going to live. But John Paul II, his final words before he passed out, according to Cardinal Zivich, he turned to his nurse and he said, "How could they do it?"
How could they do it? Yeah.
How could they do it? Which is an amazing thing, because Reagan immediately started praying for the confused young man. Reagan knew there was one shooter. He knew right away one person. John Paul II saw maybe one person, had to have known there was only one person, but he immediately fingers a they.
Yeah, he knew it was a cabal.
How could they do it? So he suspected right away that something was up.
Can we fast forward to the cell when John Paul II emerges and has that famous meeting with his would-be assassin, extends forgiveness? You point out something really interesting in the book we're talking about. By the way, I want to show the book cover, A Pope and a President. I'm going to be writing about this in my show notes at patrickcoffin.media, and there's a shortcut where you can get a copy of this. Really, it's just, I hate the phrase page turner, but this is. You point out something that really caught my attention about that meeting, that John Paul II disclosed later that his would-be killer did not say, "Please forgive me."
Yes.
He wanted to talk about one thing, and that was Our Lady of Fatima.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah, and John Paul II was very disappointed that he had come there to forgive. And Asha did not ask for forgiveness. Instead, Asha was obsessed with what he was referring to as the goddess of Fatima.
Right.
And he was afraid, maybe in this kind of radical Islamist idea, that he's not thinking forgiveness, he's thinking justice.
Wrath, right? Yeah.
Yeah, wrath. And this goddess of Fatima is going to wreak vengeance on him, lightning bolt, whatever.
Yeah.
And so he's terrified. He's in fear of this goddess of Fatima. And here again, something that a lot of Christians, non-Muslims, don't understand. Fatima is the name of the favorite daughter of Muhammad. She is the most revered woman in all of Islam, next to the Blessed Mother, Virgin Mary. And in fact, the only woman mentioned in the Quran is Mary. Mary's mentioned more in the Quran than Jesus is. So for people in the Muslim world, it's funny. A lot of our Protestant evangelical friends, Fatima, Mary, appearances, apparitions, but a lot of people in the Muslim world are like, oh yeah, Fatima. And Mary appearing? She appeared in a Coptic church in Egypt in the late 60s. They have no problem. So this is actually an area where a lot of Catholics might even have more commonality with some Muslims than they would even with some of our evangelical friends of all things.
To loop back to Fulton Sheen in his 1951 book, The World's First Love, has a chapter called Mary and the Muslims, the old-fashioned spelling. Right. That's another fascinating thing. By the way, that's a good note to me. I'm going to put that in my show notes as well. That folks have, just for that chapter alone, the book's worth the price of the book.
Mary and the Muslims.
Yeah, Mary and the Muslims,
That's right.
Now, I'm frantically trying to find it here, and you'll know it straight away. I was not aware of this, but in a speech, Ronald Reagan, casual, almost kind of natural way, mentioned in a speech in Portugal, the simplicity, like the people of Fatima.
Yes.
What?
I was blown away by that. And here, confession time, right? I wrote a book called God and Ronald Reagan in 2004, where I didn't know, even 10% of what I'm telling you now. And I had no idea that Reagan gave a speech in Portugal at all, period, where he mentioned Mary, the shrine in Fatima, the children of Fatima, the shepherd children, the appearances of Mary and Fatima, and Pope John Paul II. All of that in a May 9th, 1985 speech to the Portuguese Assembly. Not just the Portuguese Assembly, Parliament, but the Prime Minister, his cabinet, the entire government of Portugal was in there. And I found out about this, we're now, 2017? Maybe 2 years ago, when I asked Tony Dolan, who is Ronald Reagan's chief speechwriter and a very devout Catholic. Tony Dolan wrote the Evil Empire speech. He wrote Reagan's Notre Dame speech, May 17, 1981. And Tony was very interested in Fatima. And we were talking about Fatima. I said, if Reagan knew about Fatima? He said, oh, yeah, Reagan knew about Fatima. He said Fatima was long a part of the communist movement and a few other things. And then he said, Patrick, and of course, Reagan mentioned Fatima in his speech in Portugal. And I said, what?
Yeah.
So I went to the public papers of the President of the United States, and this is what I mean about how historians and people sometimes don't even think about what they know, and you're amazed sometimes what you don't put together.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times in my lifetime I've written maybe 6, 7 books on Reagan? Have I opened public papers of the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, and typed in a word? How many times have I done that? Probably like 1,000,006. I had never opened that up and typed in Fatima. So I typed in Fatima, and look at this. May 9th, 1985, Reagan, Portugal. And I found the passage. I couldn't believe it.
And both men described the other, John Paul II and President Reagan, as close friends, best friends.
Right,
I wasn't aware that they had this bond. And by the way, I love this photo. This is like, that just captures a moment of intense communion and trust and seriousness and kind of unity of purpose. It's a beautiful photo of the two of them.
Well, that was one of the photos. In fact, it's right behind me. I have a book of colored photos from, I think maybe the Chicago Tribune put it together, one of those coffee table books on John Paul II, right? And I was flipping through it maybe like 5 years ago, and I saw that picture of him and Reagan. And I just sort of, wow, look at this. This is an amazing picture. And I thought to myself, if I do this book, that's the cover right there. Yep. And fortunately, my editor at ISI Books and everybody agreed. And I later found out that was Nancy Reagan's favorite picture as well. And she describes it in explicit detail. She said, my favorite is Ronnie is talking and he's saying something very earnestly. And the Pope, he has his hand on his chin and he's listening kind of very pensively. And Nancy Reagan's top aide, Joanne Drake, who's Catholic, or maybe it was Kirby Hansen of the Reagan Foundation, they told me that they were sitting with Mrs. Reagan one day. She's flipping through old pictures of Ronnie and different world leaders. Here's Reagan and Thatcher. Here's Reagan and Brian Mulroney, right? Canadian Prime Minister. Here's Reagan and Gorbachev. And then they flip and Nancy goes, and they said, what is it? And she said, oh, my favorite. And there was a picture of Ronnie and John Paul II. She loved him. He was her favorite leader, her favorite person that her husband ever dealt with.
Most Catholics listening are more familiar with the stories of John Paul II and his very slow decline. He basically died in public, and I've wondered about how scholars today will apply his insights into the theology of the body, applying them to suffering, because there's a lot of rich, unearthed truths there. But I want to close with this, Paul. By the way, I feel like we've just scratched the white of the eggshell here. It's a lovely story about Armand Hammer Park near Bel Air, and the very, very elder Ronald Reagan is being walked on a walk, and a Jewish man recognizes him and comes up to it. And I like this sort of flash from Reagan's past. You remember that? It's on page 514.
Yes, yeah, it's very touching. The first time I heard it, I teared up, and I'll try not to here, but he's with his grandson, this Jewish man, and he's from the former Soviet Empire, and Reagan is fading. He's at that point, Reagan didn't remember the White House. I know people had told me, they said at that point he didn't even remember being president, and he comes up to him, this Jewish father or grandfather, and he said, "Mr. President, I want to thank you for doing what you did to defeat communism and for freeing my people." And Reagan just sort of looked at him a little confused, and he said, "Yes, well, that was my job, right? That's my job.
Yeah.
That's my job." And so, just a flicker of a memory there, like his memories of the Rock River in Dixon, Illinois, some things that couldn't quite leave him.
That's right.
And I love that moment too, Patrick, because Reagan was so humble. I asked Bill Clark this. I said, "Bill, did Reagan you guys ever just sit down and have a beer over taking down the Soviet Union?" He said, "No, he was too humble." He said, "You won't find Reagan saying things like, 'Yeah, I defeated the Soviet Empire.'" He said, "The best you could find from him is general statements like, 'Yes, me and my team, we did a good job.'" But that kind of moment of weakness, born of this terrible mental disease, there's almost a tacit admission, because it's more of a memory that he's clinging to. He said, yes, that's my job.
I like that he said it in the present tense. It still carried that was his assignment under his DP, under divine providence. That's my duty. That's my role. That's my function. That's my job.
That's right. And the rescuer.
Yeah,
yes.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, Paul, thank you so much for writing this book. I don't know how you have the time to output such golden. I mean, sometimes when people think history book, snore. This reads like an extended screenplay of a film. I hope someone films this, or at least does a documentary. You've probably been approached 9 times already, just this morning. Good. Yeah. Good.
So anybody interested in investing, hey, call me up. You got it. All right.
The shameless plug brought to you by the Center for
Right.
So you and I we'll start the race now to see who finds out whether or not Ronald Reagan met Bishop Sheen. Deal?
You got it. And I'm going to be speaking in Peoria, not too far ahead in the future. So I'm hoping to learn something there.
Excellent. I know Father Angelo Apostoli, who was ordained by the great man in 1967, I think. See, now I'm giving you a clue about sources. Darn.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It's been an honor, Paul. Thanks for spending time with us.
Thank you, Patrick. You're
Fantastic
great.
book. All right. Thanks,
brother. Thank you so much.
Godspeed.
God bless.
The book is called A Pope and a President, John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and the Extraordinary Untold Story of the 20th Century. You can find show notes at patrickcoffin.media. This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?